You're listening to the Quint podcast.
Welcome to Season 2 of the Quint Fortnightly podcast, Land of a Billion. We aim to bring you expert conversations about the most contentious of the holy roti kapda makan trinity, that is, the makan over our heads and the larger ecosystem that governs it. This podcast is produced in association with the Property Rights Research Consortium, supported by Umidiyar Network India. I'm Bhargavi, a researcher interested in land and access to finance, and your host for this season. To a large extent, Indian society continues to keep gender minorities in the periphery. In the mind of an average Indian, the word transgender may evoke standard stereotyped images largely popularized by the media and pop culture. The position of trans people in India has been recorded and imagined in various ways, actually. For example, from having specific roles in Hindu mythology to receiving patronage from Mughal emperors for art and culture, one can say that the trans community has been ubiquitous to the Indian subcontinent. They've been made visible and yet also invisible in many ways. In the history of modern India, however, transgender people have held public offices, they exercise voting rights, and some states have specific policies that aim to secure their welfare. In 2011, when the census introduced the other gender category, nearly 500,000 people identified themselves in that category. A 2014 estimate suggests that there are at least 3 million trans persons in India. Yet, they are largely made outliers and their access to basic rights continue to be challenged both socially and legally. Then this includes their right to own, rent and inherit property. Today we have with us Karan Gulati from the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy to speak about his latest research on the rights of trans persons under Indian inheritance laws. But before that, I wanted to bring you some voices from the trans community, voices of those whose lived experiences attest to the challenges faced by trans persons in India in exercising their right to land and housing. We asked them to share the experience that they have faced in trying to rent, buy, or inherit a property, and here's what they had to say.
As a transgender person, we have to face a lot of problems. From our homes to the world outside, we face so many issues as a transgender person just to survive. From food to shelter, we're on survival mode because not all people treat us the same. No doubt there are good people, that's why I've been able to survive this far, and I've been living in the same place in Delhi for the last 3 to 4 years. But as a transgender person, I have to face a lot of challenges, and I'm therefore grateful to those NGOs which help us with this. When we go to seek a room on rent, we don't find a room that easily. And that is because people ask us, what type of person are you? Your lifestyle is different, and so we can't give you a room on rent. So we face a lot of issues in renting a house.
Transgender and queer people often get excommunicated from their natal families that deprive them of their inheritance rights, even if the inheritance is ancestral. Often civil litigation is agitated and complications are created to create criminal litigation out of that, and the institutional challenges are galore. The law enforcement, the criminal justice system, and the legal fraternity is not very helpful. There is a huge dearth for pro bono lawyers. The district legal services authorities, the state legal services authorities are from time to time inept, incompetent, and at times even unethical and corrupt. That apart, those transgender persons who are trying to also double up in the real estate sector as real estate brokers are given tall promises. They're barely paid their brokerage, barely paid, given any incentives. From time and again, they are defrauded.
The property rights of trans. We got the judgment in Urvasi versus her family. That judgment, it came from Madurai High Court bench. I know through that, till now, she didn't get any property from her family because they are saying, the officials also, they are saying you should go to there from, you should go to there, here. So that kind of issues we are facing, and in India we have the rights to get the property rights, but the family, in that we are facing too much of oppression. We need property rights, and we have a judgment, but the ground reality, it's completely different. So government should create a clear clarification for the property rights for the trans persons.
In the order we heard, the voices were that of Sheetal Bakshi and Munesh Kumar from Delhi, Vejanti, who is a transgender activist and works closely with institutes such as the Center for Law and Policy Research and is based out of Hyderabad, and Grace Banu, who is a transgender activist and founding director of Trans Rights Now Collective. And now, moving on to our guest for the day, we have with us Karan Gulati. Karan is a lawyer in Delhi. He's a research fellow at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, an interdisciplinary team. He researches and writes on property rights and judicial administration and has often written for the law and economics policy blog, The Indian Express and the Times of India. He holds a dual law and management degree from Symbiosis University. Welcome, Karan, to the Land of a Billion podcast.
Thank you so much, Bhargavi and Land of a Billion for having me.
Great. So, Karan, when before we get to the point of discussing the property rights of transgender persons in India, I want to ask you, why is this an important issue, and why is it an important issue now?
Right. So just before I start, some caveats. I speak from what I can with the research that we've done, my co-author and I, Tushar Anand. Hopefully, we've covered all bases. However, we understand that we don't have lived experiences, and we hope to make up for that as best as possible. On the issue of why is this important, there are multiple ways of looking at it. We think that two are a good approach to take. One is why is property important, and the second is why is it important for transgender persons. So, immovable property in India is the largest asset holding of individuals, and access to property alleviates social standing of persons. So, if you have property, you have good titling, you have possession, it's likely that your social standing will rise. Now, that's all well and good. You have property, but how are people acquiring property in India? Again, we have a lot of research in India saying that inheritance is really how most people in India are acquiring property. There is a study from 2016 saying that close to 80% of all property in rural India is inherited. We have similar numbers for urban India as well. This means that one, a person needs property. Second, they usually get it via inheritance. Now, is this important for transgender persons as well? Notwithstanding, it's the fact that it's important for everyone. Transgender persons often have low income, they don't have savings, and they don't have access to housing. The National Human Rights Commission of India conducted a study in Uttar Pradesh and Delhi and found that 30% of transgender persons did not have any access to housing. So this was housing via shelter homes, via government schemes, their own property, etc. And they couldn't access any property. This is much larger than non-transgender persons in India. We have similar comparisons again for income and savings. That means it's ideal if transgender persons could access property. Not only would this alleviate their social standing, it would often bring them at par with other persons in society. Now, if all of property is rarely being acquired by inheritance, it becomes an important question to understand why don't transgender persons have property? Because if they don't, it's more likely than not that this is because they don't have inheritance rights. And that's why we look into to what extent do transgender persons in India have inheritance rights? What does the law say about it? What do courts say about it? But we'll get to it in the course of this discussion. The other thing which before we move on, I must address is that there's also the question of how are transgender persons being denied their rights. It's possible that they could get these rights if they conformed to the binary standards of the gender which was assigned to them at birth. This is especially problematic is because transgender persons don't have property and don't have inheritance rights because they're transgender. So if they were to conform to their binary standards or genders assigned to them at birth, they would have those rights, which is highly problematic given The Constitution of India guarantees them equal rights with other citizens.
Thanks, Karan. That makes sense to me. I mean, we always think of succession laws as, whether they treat the daughter and the son equally. We rarely think so much about whether they treat people of the other gender in equal terms. And our succession laws have been amended, and there is a lot of discourse on how, by treating the daughter equally under our succession laws, we're actually making her better off. And it makes sense that the same logic is extended to transgender persons. And the point that you mentioned about, people, transgender persons are deprived of inheritance rights because of their very gender. That's interesting, right? I mean, it reminds me of an incident that actually you told me about when in 2003, this was, I think, the matter of page 3 news in Bombay, where a really famous person underwent sex change operation. Just popularly, it was believed because he wanted to claim inheritance rights in his father's estate. But apart from that, I mean, what is the legal position of a transgender person under the Indian succession laws? And do you think it has changed over time or across states? Where does a transgender person fit under today's succession laws in India?
Right. So just on that point slightly, Ajay Moffat's law case is infamous due to reasons it shouldn't be. This was supposed to be one of India's first sex reassignment surgeries, great hallmark for the Indian gender movement, ended up being a legal battle about whether any of this was done for inheritance or not, right? And that just speaks to the attitude we have towards inheritance rights of minorities in general and gender minorities. So this includes women, as a matter of fact. There's other research showing that Indian law is not that great on inheritance rights of women either. But not to digress, credit where credit's due. The rights of transgender persons have gained momentum in India over the past few decades. Now, this is separate from inheritance rights, and I'll acknowledge that. But it's still important to talk about how there is more recognition than there once was. So, just to draw a small chronological path, in 2011, the census allows, as Bhargavi you mentioned, transgender persons to identify as others in the census. Close to 500,000 people identify as such. 2 years later, the central government establishes an expert committee on transgender issues. It gives a wide array of suggestions on improving education and employment of individuals. This is 2013. In another year, 2014, we have the landmark judgment of the Honorable Supreme Court in Nalsa versus Union of India. This recognizes transgender as a third gender in India, and it guarantees them all constitutional protection, which is also guaranteed to other citizens in India. In particular, it guarantees them right against discrimination on the basis of gender and sex. We have since then several other changes which have come as a follow-up to the judgment of the Supreme Court. There are certain policies of state governments. There are a wide array of these. Tamil Nadu, Madhya Pradesh come to mind. Karnataka, if I remember correctly, has one. And we also have a 2019 central law on transgender rights. Now, just to draw a benchmark of how far we've come, it is less than 100 years ago. It is in colonial India when there is an act which specifically criminalizes the fact of being a transgender. It forces you to be on a register. You can't transfer property if you're a transgender person. So these are explicit problems in the law in colonial India. Since then, we've come a long way. However, just because we've progressed doesn't mean we've achieved what we should. There's much is left to be addressed as of now. And as you mentioned at the offset, this includes property rights, and it particularly includes inheritance. Though acts in India do not specifically say anything against inheritance rights of transgender persons, they're often gender diverse and discriminatory. Now, what do I mean by this? As I tried to allude to, laws in India aren't great on rights of women in inheritance either. As an example, there is currently debate on certain discrimination under the Hindu Succession Act. It differentiates between men and women and how their self-acquired property is transferred. Now, here's the problem. If a transgender person wants to bequeath their property under the Hindu Succession Act, or one wants to inherit property under the Act, how does the Act acknowledge them? Does it acknowledge them as a male or a female? This is important because there's different treatment between male and female persons. If there was an equal treatment of both these genders, it won't be as problematic. Now, let's consider the situation. Imagine a person who was born a female but decided to undergo sex reassignment surgery and identified as a male. This is similar to what happened in the case of Ajay Mafatla. Now, under the Hindu Succession Act, two things can happen. If they have children, there's not much to differ. Whether they're identified as male or female, the property would go to their children, right? So that's good. But let's imagine they don't have any children. Who does this property go to then? If the person is recognized as per the gender at birth, which was assigned to them, which is that of a female, the property will go to their partner's family, their husband's family, right? Now, this is already before the Supreme Court, if I'm not wrong, but it's still problematic because, on the other hand, had they been recognized as a male person, the gender with which they recognize, that property would have gone to their mother or other class two heirs. Let us take a step back and understand what has happened. Just because of how the government has chosen or the court chooses to recognize a person, their property goes to different individuals. If they're identified as a female, their property goes to their partner's relatives. If they identify as a male, their property goes to their relatives. By relatives, I mean blood relatives. This means that there is no agency with the person on how they want their property to move ahead after their demise. It is up to persons in charge of moving this property from one individual to another who will choose how this property goes. This is unlike what any other citizen in this country experiences. Their property goes to whoever they know that this property should go to. There is no arbitrariness by state agencies if you're a non-transgender person. There's still problems because, again, female property goes to your husband's partner, but at the very least, you know that this is going to happen. Whereas if you're a transgender person, any and all agency is taken away from you and given to state agencies on how to identify you. And I by no means want to imply that this is a problem specific to the Hindu Succession Act. In our study, we find several legislations. The Muslim Property Act of 1937 has similar provisions. The Indian Succession Act has similar provisions. There are different problems under all of these acts, but the end result is that agency is taken from an individual and given to state agencies.
Then this would immediately take you to the question of self identification, right? So, if we were to just stay with this example, which is that the transgender person's parent passes away, and the question is, how does the property devolve? Doesn't the transgender person have the right to self identify himself as a man or woman? And given that succession laws are inherently tilted towards men, wouldn't he have incentives to identify himself as a male? And how does that play out? Or is it always left to the court to identify the transgender person as either male or female?
Right. So there is, of course, a third category in India, which is people identify as neither male or female. But sort of keeping that apart, you're right. Technically, there's an incentive to identify as a male, right? But that is a very demonic view to take of transgender persons, a problem which is enforced in us after the colonial villainization of transgender persons. What is better, right? What is a better solution? Should we stop transgender persons from identifying the way they want to on the off chance that somebody identifies as a male and then tries to acquire property which they wouldn't have otherwise been entitled to? Or is it better that we have non-discriminatory provisions in the law which don't differ between men and women? Right? This is a rhetoric question, but it's still an important one. However, I feel like this question doesn't need to come up in any case. And why is that the case? Is because transgender persons currently cannot identify themselves as transgender persons, cannot identify with the fact that they're now in our hypothetical situation, that they're now a male and were earlier a female person. Yes, legally they can. The 2019 Act has, in fact, got some improvements. Earlier, there were suggestions of medical certification. Those requirements have now been taken away under the rules. So there is some movement on this front. But if we look at the data, in 2016, there was a question posed in Rajya Sabha of how many people had Aadhaar cards which identified them as transgender persons. I forget the number, but I remember the percentage. This was 8% of the 500,000 who identified in the census. Similar numbers are there for voter ID cards in 2019, right? Only 8% of people in India, or close to, let's do 2% plus or minus, right? 10% of people in India have an identity card which recognizes them as a transgender person. Now, we're trying to get similar numbers for banking as well. That exercise is in progress, and I'll try to update the community as far as possible with what answers we get. But the larger idea is this: the transgender persons face difficulties in identifying themselves. They don't have documentation. Now, this is well understood. There are government policies, in fact, in Kerala, which says that because transgender persons will not be able to identify themselves with government documentation, we need to take certain steps. This is well acknowledged that individuals do not possess documentation. Not only in India, but in fact, there are several international reports which talk about the fact that transgender persons don't have documentation, right? This makes the challenge a first level one. Instead of talking about who will identify as what, it's perhaps better to first answer the fact that are people able to identify themselves the way they want to? Now, yes, again, as I mentioned earlier, there's some progress. There is now a online portal which one can approach to get documentation changed. But we're well aware of difficulties of online systems in India, especially when it targets marginalized communities and how accessible it is, right? And there are some reports, the fact that this hasn't really been accessible. Marginal number of identification documents have been issued over the last year or so. So there's movement, and hopefully it results in something. But as of today, it's difficult for individuals to have identification and documentation, and this is making them a legal non-entity because what they're having to do is to abide by their assigned gender instead of the one that they wish to identify as.
Understood. So, how do the courts really, play this? Then, do the courts support transgenders persons' rights in, say, for example, in an inheritance suit? How have courts viewed this?
Right. So that's a wonderful summary. Just to sort of buttress it, there are really, as before I move on to courts, two problems in India, so that we know what courts are doing about these problems. One is that there are gendered laws, and I gave the example of the Hindu Succession Act. There are similar but varied situations under Indian Succession Act, the Muslim Personal Law Act of 1937, so on and so forth. So we have gendered provisions where we shouldn't have them. The other is identifying successors. So one of this is the fact that transgender persons don't have identity documents. But then this is also related to the fact that can you identify there are other problems of identifying successors. So what do I mean by this? If a person cannot adopt a child, right? They're still taking care of this child, let's assume, but they can't adopt this child. No law in India currently recognizes inheritance of a person who's not your child. It can't be just someone living in your house, right? Or someone you're taking care of. There are very similar problems with whether you're allowed to get married or not. Your unmarried partner doesn't get your property. Your actual partner in marriage gets your property. So transgender persons are often also facing these other challenges, which are of course challenges in themselves and deserve due recognition and research separately whether individuals can adopt and marry. But these also have an interplay on inheritance rights. Now, what have courts done about this? So we tried to address this problem as exhaustively as we could. We looked at all decisions of all courts in India since 1950 that mention the term transgender. Particularly on inheritance, there are only two cases which have come up before courts, or two that we could find. What do these do? These are interesting cases. The first, so just to give an overview, in the Madras High Court, there was a case where a transgender person, a guru belonging to the Hijra community, passed away. There were two persons who claimed that they had a will signed by this person. Let's call them person A and person B. Person A was just an individual not of too much concern. Person B was the chela of this school. Now, the question before the court was how does this property move forward? The will to person A, which is the non chela person, was said to be forged. And that's why this case really on the law of it was settled because you really have one valid will. That will is also to the chela, so you don't need to get into too much detail. But the court did make some interesting observations. It said that because the guru in this case was a Muslim individual, and under Muslim personal law, a will can only transfer one third of your property. So you can't will away more than one third of your property. Two-thirds of your property has to proceed as per customary practices. The court said that if this is the case, which it is, this property has to move, at least two-thirds of this property will move to customary practices, which means it will move to the chela of this individual. This is an important judgment. It says that at least in the Muslim community, property of transgender persons has to move within the community because that is a customary practice. We've had another similar case, just that the relationship was inverse. In the second case, the chela passed away. The guru was now demanding inheritance in that property. The Himachal Pradesh High Court, which is the court of concern in this case, had a similar discussion. It's just that there were no Muslim individuals, so there was no one-third or two-third property willing away concern. The court held that since there is no other claimant to this property and the religion of the individuals has not been proved, It goes without saying that property shall move as per customary practices of the individuals. That's why this property went from the chela to the guru. There are only these two cases which we know in India which regard inheritance rights of transgender persons, both of which transfer property within the transgender community. The only problem with this is that this has left whether to transfer property within the community to the subjective satisfaction of the court. The court gets to decide whether you are in a Guru Chela relationship first. And that is also if you're a Hijra person. If you're a non Hijra transgender, the Guru Chela relationship won't exist. But the court first decides what is the relationship that you're in. Then it decides, is this customary enough? That means, is it widely followed? Then it decides within your community what is the practice. So it's answering that question for you. And then it decides how much of that property will go to you. The two situations where we have, courts have held positively that property will move within the community. But there is no guarantee that this precedent will be followed throughout the rest of India. There's also no guarantee to individuals whether their specific relation will be enforced by a court. This is not the case for other persons in India. If you have property which you ordinarily expect to move to you, you don't need to approach a court to do so. No one will fight you on that case. Of course, there are exceptions. That's why you have inheritance cases in courts. But ordinarily, you would expect that property to move to you. On the other hand, transgender persons are at the mercy of the court to give them property. Not only this, they have to again identify either as a part of a community which has already enforced rights in courts. What do I mean by this? Courts have this principle of following precedent, which means because of these two cases, now you have to show that you're in a Guru Chela relationship or something similar. That will help your case in the future dispute. That means you have to bucket yourself to what the court is looking for, not what you identify as.
But you're right, leaving them to the mercy of liberal judges is not the right thing to do. But apart from that, I mean, the listeners would know that there are huge transaction costs in approaching courts. But I wonder if this is the case. If is this a feature of emerging economies? Is this a feature of underdeveloped economies? Do you see other countries doing better? And if yes, which ones do you think do better on this?
Right. So, to some extent, property rights of transgender individuals is a new fight, right? In the in the United States, the term transgender was coined in the 1990s, right? So we've had only 30 years of history, as an example, in the US of just transgender particular rights. Now, that means that similar challenges are faced across the world. But what other countries are doing, which India is not, is at least guaranteeing civil rights to transgender persons, one, so they can identify themselves, right? So they have documentation which says that they're transgender individuals and how do they identify. Two, they can marry. Third, they can adopt. So they can prove relation to a deceased person and inherit property. How can they inherit property? Is because laws in these countries are gender neutral. They don't talk about female wife as an example. They talk about a spouse. We have some examples of this in India as well. Not to say that India is doing so poorly. The Indian Succession Act, though, has some problematic provisions. It also has some good ones, some of which talk about a child and not a male child or a female child. Right? So you have some examples in India as well, but they're not as ubiquitous in India as they are in other parts of the world. Now, there is a wide range, however. Again, as I said, this is a new fight. Some parts of the world have started identifying civil rights. So you have, as an example, you have Norway, you have Australia, you have Spain. All of these countries have recognized joint ownership of property. They've recognized inheritance rights. But then you have other countries as well, which not only don't let you directly inherit property, you also need medical sanction to prove that you're a transgender person, which means you have to get a physical examination done to say that you're a transgender individual. This was in fact introduced in India as well, but after protest has been withdrawn under the new rules which are notified by the government. So now you don't need any medical examination. You only need a self-affidavit that you're a transgender individual. So there is a spectrum across the world as well about to what extent are individuals allowed their rights. However, what's interesting is that this is not a developed world situation. Pakistan, an immediate neighbor of India, passed a Transgender Rights Act in 2018. Carries the same name as the act in India, which is passed a year later in 2019. The Pakistan Act says very specifically what will happen when a transgender person needs to inherit property. There's a particular section on inheritance. This is markedly lacking in the Indian legislation. What does it say? It says that if you're a person who now identifies as a female, you will inherit property as if you're a female. If you're a person who now identifies as if you're a male, you will inherit property as if you're a male. If you identify as neither of these, right, so it gives you an option of not being stuck within the binary framework, then you will inherit the average of what a male person and a female person would inherit. Sure, this seems the third one seems slightly problematic, and there are discussions to be had in this. But at the very least, it shows that other countries, neighboring countries, are already thinking about property and inheritance rights of individuals, and they've figured out within legislation of how to do so. What does this do? It guarantees these rights. It's a confirmed right. As to the situation, Bhargavi, that you mentioned, that I have to go to a bank or I have to go to a sub registrar and prove that I am the legal heir. None of these problems are expected to arise in Pakistan anymore. None of these problems are, of course, expected to arise in Europe, in countries where you have gender neutral laws, right? And that's where India can learn from other countries. Not only this, there's another aspect to the international learnings to be had. There's one is country case studies. What are other countries in the world doing? But there's also India has certain international obligations. It signed several instruments. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is an example. There's something called as the Yogya Karta principles. All of these talk about civil rights of individuals. In particularly, the Yogya Karta principles talk about the rights of transgender individuals. India is bound by these documents because it has no conflicting domestic law, right? So not only should India learn from other countries, it also needs to follow its own international obligations and guarantee rights to transgender individuals as they are guaranteed to other members of society. What obligations does it have? Just to touch upon the first one, which we've been talking about throughout the last hour, is that all international principles state that a person should be able to identify how they want to identify, and that they should have documentation which proves this identification, right? So that's the first level thing which India needs to do. The second, which international principles don't talk about but countries talk about, is that you need gender neutral provisions. So these are two learnings India can take from both other countries as well as international forums.
Fascinating. So it's amazing that, when we trace legal reform and the history of legal reform, some things are just so counterintuitive. Great, Karan. This was really good. And, keeping in line with the spirit of the name of our podcast, Land of a Billion, I would like to ask you, if you had to pick one core challenge that India needs to focus on to secure land rights for a billion, what would you say we all should put our weight behind? One core challenge.
So it's difficult just because of how complicated land rights are in India, but perhaps what our study shows, not exclusively for transgender individuals, is that when you have a problem, right, what do you do about it? So there are problems, of course. Let's say land titling is a problem, but what do you do about it? You end up in court to enforce that land titling. So I feel like what are courts doing about land disputes is an immensely important question to answer. So we saw that courts have some degree of subjective satisfaction for transgender rights. And we've been left wanting for these great judges who will solve all our problems. Is that how we should be looking at this? Now, there are some suggestions in the zeitgeist. Courts are supposedly immensely vacant, and that's why nothing is getting done. But that seems much more like a first level problem. Given that land is the largest holding of any individual in India, we need to look into how are land disputes moving through courts. How long does it take? How many land disputes are there? Does this vary across states and districts, cultures, communities? Can we do something about them? I know there is some work on the fact that there are too many land dispute cases or there are too many laws about land. So it seems like any other problem which individuals might have regarding land and property, and those problems are justified and deserve attention as well. But all of these problems eventually end up in court. And so it's important to sort of understand what courts are doing about land disputes.
Thanks, Karan. That's an interesting way of looking at the problem, right? Most people say that let's solve the law, let's solve, the capacity of the local sub-registrar, the capacity of the local land records offices, and we should be able to solve land-related problems. You are taking an opposite approach, which is that let's identify through court litigation what are the patterns of disputes in connection with land and then target solving those problems. So, thanks, Karan. This was great. And I look forward to reading more about this from both you and Tushar.
Thank you so much, Bhargavi and Land of a Billion for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to our podcast, Land of a Billion, produced in association with the Property Rights Research Consortium. Don't forget to catch new episodes every alternate Friday, where I will bring you a rundown on the latest charcha around land and housing in India.
Thanks for listening. Log on to the Quint's website and check out our other podcasts.